David Carter rubbed his temples and stared at the draconic grammar book spread across his desk. After 8 months of lessons, the language still felt like trying to gargle rocks while humming 3 different notes simultaneously. His throat hurt just thinking about tomorrow's session with Silvara. The old dragon matriarch had been patient with him, more patient than he probably deserved. Every week, she arrived at the Cultural Exchange Center with her scales gleaming like polished copper, her movements precise and dignified. She never showed frustration when David butchered a phrase that should have taken 10 minutes to learn, but somehow took him 3 weeks. Teaching him was part of her diplomatic assignment, and she treated it with the same seriousness she would treat a peace negotiation. David glanced at the clock on his datapad. 5 minutes until his lesson. He gathered his notes and headed down the corridor toward the private instruction rooms. Station Harmony bustled around him with the usual mix of species going about their business. A group of mantis-like Clickari chittered past him in their rapid-fire speech. 2 floating jellyfish creatures from the water sectors drifted by, their translation devices humming softly. He reached room 7 and palmed the door control. It slid open with a soft hiss. The dragon inside was not Silvara. David stopped in the doorway, his greeting dying on his lips. The creature before him was younger, smaller, though still massive by human standards. Her scales were a darker bronze, almost amber in certain lights. Where Silvara moved with ancient certainty, this dragon's tail twitched nervously against the floor. Her claws clicked in a regular rhythm on the desk surface. "Hello," she said in Galactic Common, her voice higher pitched than Silvara's rumbling tones. "I am Lyra. My mother Silvara cannot teach today. I will instruct you instead." David stepped fully into the room and let the door close behind him. "Is your mother all right?" Lyra's inner eyelids flickered, a dragon expression David had learned meant distress. "She has scale rot. It is not dangerous, but very painful. She must return to our home world for treatment in the volcanic springs. The heat and minerals will heal her, but it takes many weeks." "I'm sorry to hear that," David said, taking his usual seat across from her. "Please tell her I hope she recovers quickly." "I will." Lyra opened a teaching tablet, her claws moving uncertainly across its surface. "Mother said you were working on the conditional tense structures, the ones that indicate possible futures versus certain futures." David nodded, pulling out his own notes. He noticed Lyra had a small journal beside her tablet, its cover worn and creased from heavy use. Something was written on it in draconic script, but he couldn't read it from this angle. The lesson began awkwardly. Lyra clearly knew the material. Her understanding of grammar was flawless, but she lacked her mother's teaching rhythm. She stumbled over explanations, backtracked to clarify points, and kept glancing at her journal as if it contained answers to questions David hadn't asked. Despite the rough start, David found himself enjoying the session in a different way. Where Silvara taught with formal precision, Lyra offered context. When David struggled with a particular phrase structure, Silvara would drill him on pronunciation. Lyra instead explained why dragons use that structure, what emotional weight it carried, what situations called for it. "This phrase here," Lyra said, pointing to a line in David's textbook, "you would use it when speaking of someone who has passed beyond. It carries respect, but also continuity. In draconic thought, death does not end a person's influence on the world." David tried the phrase, his throat straining to produce the layered tones. It came out mangled and flat. Lyra's tail stopped twitching. She leaned forward slightly. "Try pushing the sound from deeper in your chest. Humans have flexible vocal structures. You can make sounds we cannot, but you must learn which muscles to use." David tried again. This time it sounded closer, though still clearly wrong to his ears. "Better," Lyra said, and something like surprise colored her voice. "My mother said you were determined." I see she was correct. They worked through the rest of the lesson with increasing ease. Lyra relaxed as she taught, her nervousness fading into genuine engagement with the material. David found himself asking more questions than usual, drawn in by her willingness to explain the culture behind the language. Near the end of their time, Lyra's data pad chimed softly. She glanced at it, and David saw her whole body tense. On the screen was a calendar display with one date circled multiple times in bright red. The date was 3 weeks away. Lyra quickly blanked the screen, but not before David noticed her claws had started trembling. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," Lyra said too quickly. She began gathering her materials. "We should conclude for today. You have made acceptable progress. We will meet again in 3 days, same time." David agreed, sensing she wanted to end the conversation. As he stood to leave, he noticed Lyra opening her worn journal again. Inside, he glimpsed sketches of stars, constellation patterns drawn with careful detail. Mathematical notations filled the margins. At the top of the page was a date, the same one he had seen circled on her calendar. Lyra noticed him looking and closed the journal with a snap. Her tail resumed its nervous twitching. "Thank you for accommodating the change in instructor," she said formally. "I know my teaching style is different from my mother's." "Different isn't bad," David replied. "I actually understood some things today that I've been struggling with for months. Your mother is an excellent teacher, but so are you." Something flickered across Lyra's reptilian features. Relief maybe, or gratitude. "That is kind of you to say. I will see you in 3 days." David left the room with his head full of conjugations and tonal patterns, but also with questions. What was so important about that date? Why did Lyra carry those star charts with her? And why did she look so desperately sad when she looked at them? He suspected the answers would matter more than any grammar lesson. 3 days turned into a pattern. David met with Lyra twice more over the following week, and each session revealed a little more of who she was beneath the nervous exterior. She still carried that worn journal everywhere, still glanced at her calendar with increasing frequency. But she also smiled more, her teaching growing confident as she found her rhythm. During their fourth lesson together, David made a breakthrough with a particularly difficult sound combination. Lyra actually clapped her claws together in approval, a gesture he had never seen Silvara make. "Excellent. You're beginning to feel the language rather than just speak it. That is when true understanding begins." David grinned, despite his aching throat. "I have a good teacher." Lyra ducked her head, a surprisingly bashful gesture for a creature with fangs the size of kitchen knives. She opened her journal, and this time she didn't snap it shut when David's gaze wandered toward it. The pages were covered in notes, sketches of astronomical phenomena, and what looked like poetry written in flowing draconic script. "May I ask what you're working on?" David ventured. "Those star charts look complicated." Lyra's claws traced the edge of the journal. For a long moment, David thought she wouldn't answer. Then she sighed, a sound like steam escaping from a kettle. "It is a celestial alignment," she said quietly. "Certain stars form a specific pattern every 5 years as seen from my homeworld. I am calculating when that pattern will be visible from this station." "That's impressive math," David said. "Are you an astronomer?" "No. The alignment is important to me for personal reasons." She closed the journal, but kept her claw resting on its cover. "In dragon culture, we mark significant life events by the stars overhead at the time. Births, deaths, bonding ceremonies. The sky becomes part of the memory." David leaned back in his chair. This was the most personal information Lyra had shared. "We have something similar on Earth. Some cultures believe the stars influence destiny. Others just use them to mark time and remember important dates. How do humans remember their dead?" The question came out abruptly, as if Lyra had been holding it back and it finally escaped. David blinked at the shift in conversation, but answered honestly. "Different ways depending on culture. Some hold ceremonies on the anniversary of a death. Some visit graves. Some light candles or say prayers. Mostly we talk about the person, tell stories about them, keep their memory alive through words." Lyra's golden eyes fixed on him with sudden intensity. "Words? Yes. We do this too, but in the old tongue. The language must be draconic for the memory to be properly honored. It is a way of ensuring the past is not lost, that those who came before remain part of those who continue." "That's beautiful," David said, and meant it. Lyra looked away, her tail curling around the legs of her chair. "My mother was supposed to help me with something. A remembrance ceremony. But her illness means she cannot. I am alone on this station, far from my clan." Understanding began to dawn on David. The calendar, the star charts, the careful study of dates, the alignment you're tracking. It's for someone who died. My brother. Lyra's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Finn died 5 years ago in a shuttle accident. He was traveling to the outer colonies to begin xenobiology studies. The star pattern overhead on my home world when he was born will be visible from this station in 2 weeks. I need to speak the remembrance phrases while those stars are positioned correctly, or his memory will not be properly honored this year. David felt the weight of what she was saying. And you need someone who speaks draconic to perform the ceremony with you. Lyra nodded slowly. The ritual requires at least 2 voices. One to speak the name, one to acknowledge it. Dragons believe that memory lives in language, and language requires sharing. A name spoken alone dies in the air. A name spoken and heard lives forever. Is that why you took over your mother's teaching duties? David asked gently. Not just to cover for her, but because you needed someone here who could speak the language. I did not know if you would be skilled enough, Lyra admitted. I hoped. Mother said you were progressing well, but the ritual phrases are complex. They require proper pronunciation, correct tonal emphasis. An error would dishonor rather than honor. She looked at him directly. I've been too afraid to ask if you would help me. What if you said no? What if you tried and failed? I thought perhaps if I taught you more, if you improved enough, I could ask when the time came. David understood her fear. Dragons valued honor and propriety above almost everything. Asking for help with something so sacred and then having the help fail would be worse than not asking at all. But she had no other options. Her mother was gone. Her clan was light years away. David was her only possibility. I'll help you, he said at Lyra's head snapped up. You do not know what you are promising. The phrases are difficult even for dragons. For a human, then we have 2 weeks to prepare, David interrupted. Teach me. Drill me as hard as you need to. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise I'll try with everything I have. Lyra stared at him, her reptilian face difficult to read. Then slowly, carefully, she opened her journal and turned it toward him. The pages were filled with phonetic breakdowns of draconic phrases, practice notes, translation guides. She had been preparing this for weeks, hoping against hope that someone would be able to help her. This is what we must speak, she said, her voice thick with emotion. These are the words that will keep my brother's memory alive for another year. David looked at the complex sounds, the intricate tonal patterns. It looked impossible, but Lyra was trusting him with something precious, something irreplaceable. Humans had earned their place in the galaxy by surviving impossible odds. Maybe that persistence could serve a gentler purpose. Then let's get started, he said. The next 2 weeks transformed David's relationship with the draconic language from academic study to desperate necessity. Lyra drilled him relentlessly, their sessions stretching from 1 hour to 3, sometimes 4. She booked the observation room for their practice, the one with a wide viewport facing the section of space where the star alignment would appear. David's throat became perpetually sore. He drank endless cups of honeyed tea that the station medical staff recommended for vocal strain. His regular work suffered as he spent every spare moment reviewing the phonetic guides Lyra had prepared. The phrases swam through his dreams, tangling with his normal speech until his co-workers asked if he was feeling well. But slowly, painfully, progress happened. No, Lyra said for the 100th time, her tail thumping against the floor in frustration. The second tone must rise then fall. You're making it fall then rise. It changes the entire meaning from he who flew among stars to he who fell from stars. Do you see the difference? David tried again, his vocal cords protesting. The sound came out closer this time. Lyra's crest flattened against her head, her version of a satisfied nod. Better. Again. Between drilling sessions, Lyra talked about Finn. At first the stories came reluctantly, pulled out like splinters. But as the days passed and David proved he wouldn't mock or dismiss her grief, the memories flowed more freely. Finn had been curious about everything, apparently. He collected samples of alien plant life and kept them in poorly labeled jars that occasionally exploded due to unexpected chemical reactions. He could never remember to turn off the cooking units in their family dwelling, resulting in countless burnt meals and one minor fire. He had wanted to catalog every species in the known galaxy and had made it through approximately 0.03% before his death. He would have liked you, Lyra said one evening as they took a break from practice. He believed humans were fascinating. Most species thought your kind were just dangerous death worlders. But Finn said any species that developed thousands of languages on one planet must have incredible cultural complexity. David smiled at that. Sounds like he was smarter than most of the galaxy gives us credit for. He was brilliant, Lyra said quietly, and kind. He never made others feel small for not knowing things. He shared knowledge like it was food, freely given to anyone hungry for it. Her claws traced patterns on the observation window. I miss him terribly. Some days I forget he is gone. I think of something interesting and want to tell him. Then remember I cannot. David had lost his own grandmother 3 years ago. He understood that particular pain, the habit of grief that outlasted logic. What happened to him, if you don't mind me asking? Lyra was silent for a long moment. Outside the viewport, ships moved in orderly patterns around the station, small lights against the infinite dark. Shuttle malfunction, she finally said. The vessel he was traveling on suffered a cascade failure in its engines. The crew tried to evacuate, but the escape pods malfunctioned as well. Finn was 23 standard years old. In dragon terms, he had barely reached adulthood. She turned away from the window. My mother took it very hard. She and Finn were close. When this anniversary approached, she promised she would be here to help me perform the ritual. But her scale rot grew worse, and the doctor said waiting even another week might cause permanent damage. Understanding clicked into place for David. So she sent you to me. She'd been teaching me all those months specifically so I could help you when she couldn't. Lyra's inner eyelids flickered. I did not realize until I arrived, and she explained. Mother's cunning that way. She saw a possibility and cultivated it without telling anyone her plan. She gambled that a human would have the capacity to learn enough and the character to want to help. That's a lot of faith to put in a species most people consider violent and unpredictable, David said. Mother has studied humans extensively. She says your species is misunderstood. Lyra met his eyes. Most races see your survival of Earth and assume you're naturally aggressive. They forget that surviving such a world requires not just strength, but adaptability, cooperation, and empathy. A species that only fought would have destroyed itself long before achieving space travel. David had never thought about it that way. Humans were used to being seen as the dangerous newcomers, the ones other species watched nervously. The idea that someone might see humanity's harsh origins as evidence of positive traits rather than negative ones was novel. I hope I can prove your mother right, he said. Lyra picked up her journal, opening to a page near the back. There is something else you should know about this ritual. In dragon culture, to speak the remembrance phrases with someone is to bond with them as family. It is not a casual thing. By learning these words and agreeing to speak them with me, you are accepting a place in my clan structure. David processed this. So after the ritual, we'll be considered family? Yes, it is a serious commitment. You would have obligations to our clan, and we would have obligations to you. It is not reversible. She looked at him seriously. I should have told you this before you agreed to help. It was wrong of me to assume you understood the full implications. If you wish to withdraw, I will not blame you. David thought about it for all of 5 seconds. I don't want to withdraw. If anything, knowing this makes me more determined to get it right. Your brother deserves to be remembered properly, and if doing that means I gain a dragon family, I'm honored. Lyra's whole body relaxed. Tension David hadn't realized she was carrying bleeding away. Thank you, she said, her voice rough. You cannot know what this means to me. Then let's make sure I'm ready, David replied. He picked up his practice notes. From the top. And don't go easy on me. Lyra's eyes gleamed. I never intended to. The day of the alignment arrived with clear viewing conditions, a small mercy David was grateful for. He had barely slept the night before, running through the phrases in his head until they blurred together into nonsense. His throat felt raw despite the medical treatments, and his hand shook slightly as he made his way to the observation room. Lyra was already there when he arrived. She had transformed the sterile space into something ceremonial. Smooth stones arranged in circular patterns covered the floor, each one carved with draconic symbols that seemed to shimmer in the ambient light. Incense burned in small braziers, filling the air with a sharp, clean scent that reminded David of thunderstorms. The chairs had been removed, leaving the center of the room open. Lyra herself wore formal scales, or what David assumed were formal. Bands of deep blue and purple wrapped around her neck and forearms, contrasting with her bronze natural coloring. They caught the light and threw back tiny rainbows. Her claws had been polished until they gleamed like dark metal. "You came early," David said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. "I needed time to prepare," Lyra replied. She gestured to a spot on the floor near the viewport. "Stand there. When the alignment reaches its peak, we begin. The stars must be in full configuration for the words to carry their proper weight." David took his position. Through the viewport, he could see the section of space they had been tracking. Several stars were already moving into place, their relative positions shifting as the station orbited and space wheeled around them. In about 30 minutes, if Lyra's calculations were correct, they would form the exact pattern that had been visible on her homeworld the night Finn was born. "Are you ready?" Lyra asked. In her claws, she held her worn journal, open to the pages they had practiced from so many times. But she wasn't looking at it. She had the phrases memorized so deeply they might as well have been carved into her bones. "As ready as I'll ever be," David said, and was surprised to find it was true. The nervousness was still there, but beneath it was a strange calm. He had done everything he could to prepare. Either it would be enough or it wouldn't. All that remained was the doing. Lyra set the journal aside carefully, treating it with the reverence of a sacred text. "I want you to understand what we are doing. In dragon belief, death is not an ending, but a transformation. The body returns to fire and stone, but the memory, the essence of who someone was, that lives on in the stories we tell and the names we speak. This ritual is how we keep that memory strong." "I understand," David said. "No," Lyra said gently. "Not yet, but you will." They waited in silence as the stars continued their slow dance. David found himself thinking about Finn, this dragon he had never met but felt he somehow knew. A young scholar with boundless curiosity and terrible cooking skills. Someone who saw wonder in the galaxy instead of danger. Someone who died far too young with his work barely begun. "My mother really set this up months ago?" David asked, breaking the quiet. Lyra nodded. "When she learned of her illness, she knew she could not delay treatment until after the anniversary. She had been teaching you for months already, but she intensified the lessons, focused on the grammatical structures that appear in remembrance phrases. She prepared you without telling you what the preparation was for. She took a big risk," David said. "I could have refused to help you." "She told me humans understand grief," Lyra replied. "That despite your reputation as warriors, you are deeply loyal to those you care about. She believed once you understood what the ritual meant, you would not turn away." Lyra glanced at him. She was correct. The stars shifted into position. David felt the change more than saw it, some instinctive recognition that the moment had arrived. Lyra sensed it too. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her scales. Dragons ran hot, their internal temperatures maintained by metabolism that would cook a human from the inside out. "The alignment is complete," Lyra said formally, her voice taking on a deeper resonance. "We begin now. Listen carefully to my pronunciation and match it as closely as you can. Do not fear mistakes. Sincerity carries more weight than perfection." She launched into the opening phrase, her voice dropping into registers David couldn't hope to match. The words rolled through the room like distant thunder, each syllable precisely weighted and placed. This was the part David didn't need to speak, only witness. He listened intently, hearing the grief and love woven into every sound. When Lyra finished, silence fell. It was David's turn that he opened his mouth and began. The first phrase came out rough, his human vocal cords struggling with the harmonic requirements. He could hear how it differed from what it should sound like. The way his version was flat where it should be rounded, sharp where it should be smoothed out. Lyra's tail twitched, but she didn't correct him. The ritual had begun. There was no stopping now. David pushed through his nervousness and tried the second phrase. This one came out better. Somewhere in his mind, muscle memory from 2 weeks of relentless practice took over. His throat found positions he hadn't known it could reach. The sounds weren't perfect, weren't even close to what a native speaker could produce, but they were recognizable. They carried meaning that he saw. Lyra's eyes widen slightly. Encouragement and surprise mixed in her expression. The third phrase was the hardest, a twisting combination of sounds that required him to speak 2 tones simultaneously through some trick of throat positioning. David had never managed it properly in practice. He tried now, putting everything he had into the attempt. Something clicked. His throat vibrated in a way it never had before. The sound that emerged wasn't quite right, but it was closer than any previous attempt. Close enough. Lyra's crest rose, a sign of approval and recognition. The ritual continued, the two of them trading phrases back and forth. David stumbled through some, managed others surprisingly well. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. His throat burned, but he kept going because Lyra needed him to, because Finn deserved to be remembered, because stopping was not an option. The ritual reached its heart. Lyra's voice grew stronger, more resonant, as she began speaking stories instead of formal phrases. She told of Finn's first attempt at flying, how he had misjudged the thermal currents and crashed into a decorative fountain in the clan gathering space. She spoke of his obsession with cataloging the microscopic life found in volcanic vents, how he would spend hours staring through analysis scopes while his dinner grew cold beside him. David's role shifted. No longer was he speaking memorized phrases. Instead, he responded with the traditional listener's acknowledgments. Short sounds that meant I hear, I remember, the story continues. These he had practiced until they were reflexive, and now they flowed from him with increasing ease. Lyra spoke of Finn's friendship with a Klickari researcher, how the two of them had developed a hybrid sign language to discuss concepts neither of their species had words for. She told of his terrible habit of leaving experiment notes scattered everywhere, written in handwriting so atrocious that even other dragons struggled to read it. Her voice wavered when she described their last conversation, how Finn had been excited about a new fellowship opportunity, how he had promised to send her samples of any interesting organisms he discovered. Through it all, David responded, I hear, I remember. The story continues. Simple phrases, but loaded with meaning. He was not just listening, he was bearing witness. He was taking these memories into himself and carrying them forward. In dragon terms, he was becoming part of Finn's continued existence in the world. The star alignment outside the viewport held steady, a configuration that would only last for another 15 minutes before the stellar positions shifted again. They were racing against cosmic timing, fitting an entire year's worth of remembrance into the narrow window when the universe itself aligned properly. Lyra's voice cracked. She had been speaking for nearly 40 minutes straight, her controlled draconic pronunciation giving way to raw emotion. Tears formed in her golden eyes, thick and crystalline. In dragon physiology, crying was rare, reserved for the deepest grief or joy. The tears rolled down her scaled cheeks and hit the stone floor with soft pinging sounds, like glass beads falling. He should still be here, she said, abandoning formal phrasing entirely. He had so much left to discover, so many questions left to ask. The galaxy is lesser without his curiosity in it. David found himself responding not with the ritual phrase, but with his own words, in draconic, cobbled together from everything he had learned. His questions live in those who remember him. His curiosity passed to you. You continue his search. It wasn't perfect grammar. The tenses were probably wrong. But Lyra froze, staring at him with something like wonder. You understand, she whispered. You truly understand. They had reached the final phase of the ritual. This was the part Lyra had made David practice most intensely because it required the closest coordination. They would speak together, their voices layered, saying Finn's full name in the old tongue, while making a promise to carry his memory forward. Lyra positioned herself so they were facing each other with the stars visible behind her. David could see the alignment beginning to shift, the cosmic clock running down. They had perhaps 5 minutes left. Together now, Lyra said. On my mark. She began a low harmonic, a baseline tone that thrummed through the floor. David added his voice, finding the complementary frequency that Lyra had taught him. Their sounds wove together, not perfectly harmonized but close enough. Human and dragon, two entirely different species with different languages and different physiologies, finding common ground in shared purpose. Lyra spoke Finn's name. It rolled out in a cascade of sound that seemed to contain multitudes. Each syllable meant something. He who flies, seeker of small wonders, born under the 5 stars. Together they formed an identity, a capsule of who Finn had been distilled into pure language. David echoed her, his pronunciation clumsy but sincere. His version of the name lacked her precise tonal control, but it carried his honest effort. He poured into those syllables everything he had learned about Finn over the past 2 weeks, all the stories and small details that had painted a picture of someone David wished he could have met. The name hung in the air between them. Through the viewport, the star alignment reached its absolute peak, 5 points of light forming a perfect configuration. For a handful of heartbeats, past and present aligned. The stars that had witnessed Finn's birth now witnessed his remembrance. Then Lyra spoke the final phrase, the promise that the ritual required. Your name is spoken. Your name is heard. Your name is carried forward. Memory lives. David responded with the answering promise, the one he had practiced until his throat bled. I hear. I remember. I carry forward. Memory lives. The stars began to drift out of alignment. The ritual window closed. It was done. Lyra collapsed. Her legs folded under her, and she sank to the stone floor, her massive body curling into itself. Great racking sobs shook her frame, the kind of grief that had been held back by ritual structure and now broke free. She made sounds David had never heard from her, keening notes of loss that needed no translation, that David's instinct was to go to her, to offer comfort through touch. But he remembered his training. Dragons didn't accept uninvited physical contact. It violated personal boundaries in ways humans didn't quite understand. So instead, he sat down on the floor near her, not touching but present, close enough that she would know she wasn't alone. Minutes passed. Lyra's sobs gradually quieted. Her breathing steadied. Slowly she uncurled, lifting her head to look at David through tear-brightened eyes. Thank you, she said, her voice raw. Thank you for learning. Thank you for trying. Thank you for caring about someone you never met. David's own throat was tight with emotion. He sounded like someone worth remembering. Lyra's tail moved slowly across the floor until its tip rested gently against David's foot. The lightest possible contact, but in dragon terms it meant everything. Permission granted. Connection acknowledged. You are family now, Lyra said, by ritual and by choice. My clan is your clan. Through the viewport, the stars continued their endless dance, indifferent to the small drama that had played out in their light. But for David and Lyra, something fundamental had changed. They were no longer teacher and student, no longer dragon and human. They were something new, something the galaxy was still learning to recognize. They were family, bound by memory and stars and the willingness to honor what mattered most. Life on Station Harmony continued its usual rhythm, but for David, everything felt different. He walked the same corridors, ate in the same dining facilities, did the same diplomatic work, yet he moved through it all with a new awareness. He was no longer just a human working in a galactic community. He was part of a dragon clan, bound by ritual and recognition. Lyra's teaching sessions resumed, but they had transformed into something beyond formal instruction. She taught him clan history now, the long lineage of her family stretching back thousands of years. She shared recipes for traditional dragon foods and laughed when David politely declined to try raw volcanic minerals. She showed him how to read the subtle movements of dragon body language, the meanings behind tail positions and crest angles that he had been missing all along. My mother will return soon, Lyra said one afternoon as they sat in the observation room where the ritual had taken place. The ceremonial stones had been removed, but the space still felt significant to David, weighted with memory. She has sent word that her treatment is complete and she's traveling back to the station. David felt a flutter of nervousness. He had helped perform a sacred ritual, had been adopted into a dragon clan through that participation. But he had never met the matriarch who had orchestrated the whole thing. What if Silvara disapproved? What if she thought David had performed the ritual inadequately? Lyra must have sensed his worry because her tail twitched in amusement. She will be pleased. I have sent her recordings of the ceremony. She says you exceeded her expectations. I made so many mistakes, David protested. You made human mistakes while speaking dragon words. That you managed to speak them at all is what matters. Lyra tilted her head, studying him. Do you know what my mother told me before I came here? She said humans are the galaxy's bridge builders. Not because you're naturally peaceful, you are not. Not because you are weak, you are anything but. You build bridges because you survived a world that should have killed you. And that survival taught you that cooperation works better than isolation. David thought about Earth, its extreme weather and geological instability, its incredible biodiversity and resulting competition for resources. Humans had survived not by becoming the strongest predator, but by forming groups, sharing knowledge, adapting to circumstances. They had looked at a hostile world and decided the best response was to understand it rather than simply fight it. Is that why your mother chose to teach me? David asked. Because she thought humans would be good at learning other cultures? Partly, but also because she believed you specifically would care enough to try. Lyra's expression softened. She has studied human behavior extensively. She says your species has a strange quality. You form attachments to things that do not benefit you. You adopt orphan animals from other species. You preserve art and knowledge, even when it has no practical use. You mourn those you barely knew. Most species find this confusing, but my mother finds it beautiful. 3 days later, Silvara returned to Station Harmony. David was in his quarters reviewing trade agreements when his door chimed. He opened it to find both Silvara and Lyra standing in the corridor. The older dragon's scales had regained their copper luster, glowing with health. Her presence filled the space with quiet authority. David Carter, Silvara said formally, I have come to thank you for honoring your commitment to my family. David stepped aside to let them enter, though his quarters were barely large enough for one dragon, let alone two. Silvara moved with careful precision, her bulk somehow avoiding every piece of furniture. Lyra followed, settling near the viewport. I'm honored to have been able to help, David said, suddenly very aware of how small his living space was compared to dragon standards. Silvara's golden eyes, so similar to her daughter's, studied him with unsettling intensity. You took on a significant responsibility. The ritual is not simple even for native speakers. That you succeeded speaks to your character. I had a good teacher, David said, nodding toward Lyra. You had too, Silvara corrected. Every lesson I gave you for 8 months was preparation, though you did not know it. I taught you the grammatical foundations, the tonal patterns, the cultural context, all of it building toward a single purpose. David finally asked the question that had been bothering him. Why? Why invest so much time in preparing me for this? There must have been other options. Silvara settled onto her haunches, a posture that suggested a long explanation was coming. When I learned my scale route would prevent me from attending the anniversary ritual, I faced a difficult choice. I could have asked the Dragon Embassy to send a representative. I could have called on clan members to make the journey here. These would have been proper, traditional solutions. But you chose a human instead, David finished. I chose you specifically, Silvara said, because I have watched humans carefully since your species joined the galactic community. Most races see you as dangerous. They remember that you evolved on a death world and assume violence is your primary nature. They are wrong. Lyra spoke up. Mother believes humans are the most emotionally intelligent species in the known galaxy. You have to be. Surviving Earth required not just physical strength, but incredible social cooperation. You had to understand each other's needs, share resources, work together against environmental threats. That selection pressure created a species that excels at empathy. Silvara nodded. When I needed someone to help my daughter honor her brother, I could have chosen safety and tradition. Instead, I chose someone who would care. Someone who would approach a sacred ritual with genuine respect rather than mere obligation. I gambled that a human would have the emotional capacity to understand what the ritual meant and the dedication to execute it properly. David felt the weight of her words. She had bet on humanity's compassion, on his compassion specifically, and had structured 8 months of teaching around that bet. I hope I proved you right, he said quietly. Silvara reached into a pouch at her side and withdrew something small. When she opened her claw, David saw a scale. Not a shed scale, but one that looked like it had been carefully removed. It gleamed like polished metal, etched with intricate patterns. This is an ancestral scale, Silvara said. It belonged to my grandmother's grandmother, passed down through our family line for generations. To give it to someone is to mark them as clan, as family, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. She held it out to David. He took it carefully, feeling the unexpected weight. The scale was warm, retaining heat, even separated from its owner. You are part of our clan now, Silvara continued. Not by blood, but by choice and by ritual. When we speak our lineage, your name will be included. When we gather for ceremonies, you will be called. When you need aid, we will provide it. This is not a small thing. David looked at the scale in his hand, then at the 2 dragons in his quarters. Lyra watched him with open affection. Silvara observed with approval. He thought about how strange it was, how improbable. A human from Earth adopted into a dragon clan because he had learned to say a dead brother's name correctly. But it wasn't really about pronunciation, was it? It was about showing up, about caring, about being willing to honor what mattered to others even when it cost you something. Thank you, David said, and meant it with everything he had. I'll do my best to honor this gift. Silvara's crest rose in satisfaction. You already have. After they left, David sat by his viewport holding the ancestral scale. Outside, the station orbited through space, surrounded by thousands of species all learning to coexist. Humans had joined that community as fighters, as survivors of a harsh world. But maybe their real contribution would be something else. Maybe humanity's gift to the galaxy wasn't their ability to endure hostile environments. Maybe it was their willingness to learn other languages, honor other traditions, and care about grief that wasn't their own. Maybe the galaxy needed bridge builders more than it needed warriors. David placed the scale carefully on his desk where he would see it every day. A reminder of the family he had gained and the responsibility that came with it. A reminder that sometimes the most human thing you could do was recognize the humanity in others, regardless of how many scales or claws they had. Outside his window, the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal. But here, in this small room on this small station, something had changed. Memory had been honored. Family had been formed. And a human had learned that surviving Earth's challenges had prepared his species not for conquest, but for connection. That seemed like a much better legacy.